So, Bill, last time we talked, we just kind of talked about your history, Marvel Comics at large, stuff like that. I would love to pick your brain about comic books in general, good entry points for people, and just kick it off with Miles Morales and your history with Miles. And the first question we could start with is what when this project came online, what kind of insight did you give to Insomniac Games, kind of from the Marvel Games perspective?
First of all, hello, Andrew. Good to see you.
Hello.
So my personal history with Miles, this goes back years. So 9 years ago, when Miles was first swung onto the scene, it's amazing to think that he's a character. He's not even a decade old, and he's really has soared in popularity and found a special place in people's hearts. And that is really difficult to do. We had a history of introducing characters all the time. And for someone to not only stick around, but to thrive like this really is a testament to the thought and the heart that went into creating Miles. From top to bottom, they really thought about him, from his name with the classic, double M, like the double P for Peter Parker. That's a little comic book Marvel touch. That's smart. The design of his costume, where you look at it and you say, that's a Spider-Man, but I haven't seen that Spider-Man before. Who is that? To the creation of his character, his origin, where he comes from, his personality, his differences. Again, and I think most importantly, it's another point in Marvel history where we revealed sort of how it's baked into our DNA, how we always strive to be inclusive and embrace diversity. Many of us, like me, I grew up, Storm was leader of the X-Men. And Sam Wilson was standing alongside Captain America. And then eventually Steve Rogers asked Sam to carry the shield. And there's numerous examples throughout our history. And I always say, we're not perfect, but we try. And I know that's something that I appreciated as a true believer growing up. I noticed it at a very young age. I probably didn't notice and understand all the implications, but I really appreciated the difference in the Marvel stories, in the characters, in Stan Lee's soapboxes. So it's really ingrained in us. So this is just an example of the modern group of creators and editors just trying to carry that torch forward, because we really believe in it. So Miles debuted in 2011, and right away we got a lot of mail, and we, in addition to positive mail, we got a lot of negative mail. And I remember I got one from a father that said he was going to go into the backyard when his kids got home from school and burn all their copies of Spider-Man. And because he felt we had like killed Peter Parker and replaced him, with an underlying comment that perhaps this was a person of color. So I wrote back to him and I said, first of all, this is happening in the Ultimate Universe. You still have Peter Parker in the 616 universe. And I said, hey, you don't have to like it. You don't have to even buy the comics for your kids, but please don't burn their comics. That will have an impact on them. That will create a negative memory. Not that there's this new Spider-Man that you don't care for, but burning their comics. I don't know if you listened to me. I hope you did. But then about an hour later after that, we all got an email. All the editors at Marvel have access to this Marvel Comics email account. And so we can get letters and use them for the letters pages. We all got a letter from a young woman saying thank you, that now my little brother has a Spider-Man that looks like him. And that really made it all worthwhile. And to this day, we remember that one letter. And that was just the beginning. And we've seen it again and again and again. So that's what we take to heart. That's what inspires us. we always feel that our creators, editors, the whole team is looking at their own lives, looking at the world around them, putting them into the stories we tell, whether it's comics, in this case, a game. It goes out into the real world, and then the real world responds to us. It has an impact on them. I don't know if you've seen some of the reaction videos to the gameplay trailers. They're really remarkable. We see that, and then that impacts us and inspires us to do more. So in a nutshell, that's my background with Miles. I was lucky enough to actually work with Brian Michael Bendis, the writer, and this was later in the run of Ultimate Spider-Man, but I got to edit a few issues. That was a true honor. I think Brian is, phenomenal writer, and Sarah Pichelli, and there are others who contributed to the creation of Miles. It was a whole group effort. So he had a place in my heart. I think he has a place in many people's hearts at Marvel. We view him as like a little brother that we really love. And so when it came time, it was really Insomniac that got the ball rolling. And that's always the best scenarios that we found is, our job at Marvel Games, our team, we're there to help. So we're there to help the studios bring their vision to life. How can we help them tell their Marvel story? And so we do that in many ways. And part of it is we provide comics, talk about things. And so when we were working with Brian Intihar and Jacinda Shu with the team, we sent them a bunch of Spider-Man reference. And I think we also sent along some Miles Morales comics, because we were discussing at the very beginning, well, how old do we make our Peter? Right? And there was a debate of, do we make him in high school? Because the Spider-Man story is always a coming of age story. Or do we make him older? Where do we go with that? And I think they've settled upon something really interesting. Presenting a Peter Parker in his early 20s. So it's not what we're seeing currently in the film, and it's not what's in the comics. It's our own story. It's our own Peter, and he's still very much a young man. When you think about what we were like when we were in our early 20s, it's still that's a point where we're making these big decisions, and that's what a coming of age story is. And then they really latched on to Miles, and Brian Intihar said to me, "Bill, I've read these Miles comics, and we just love this guy." And he allows them to tell that teenage Spider-Man story, which is part of the reason why they invented him in the comics to begin with. Peter was older. Okay, how can we get back to that Stan Lee and Steve Ditko stories of Spider-Man as a high schooler? There's something magic about that. And so we began talking about Miles, and Brian asked, "Can we have him in the game?" And we're like, "Yeah, that continues how your Spider-Man story is different. How the Insomniac game version of Spider-Man is different. Mary Jane works for the Bugle. Norman is the mayor." And this was another thing that felt right. That wasn't yet seen in the comics, but it feels right. So we just try to streamline it and say, look, we don't have the time in the game to introduce the idea of the Spider-Verse, and Miles comes from another universe. We're really not telling that story. But then we just said, could he be in this world? We're like, yeah, that streamlines it. He's just in this New York. And then we told his origin story, in the game slowly, and you see what happens to him. And we wanted to make sure that, the first Spider-Man game was clearly a Peter Parker story. But any Peter Parker story is about his supporting cast. And so they came up with a very genius way to weave him in and to have Miles volunteer and work at the Feast Center. And so you get that story of Miles being a fan of Spider-Man and then getting to work alongside him and Mary Jane being part of the team. And then that journey of, I don't just have to be a fan of a hero. I can be a hero. I can not only love Spider-Man, help Spider-Man, I can be a Spider-Man. And so they told that story just in a wonderful way. And so seeing at the end of the first game, Peter and Miles jumping up to the roof and facing each other, or the ceiling and facing each other, really magical. And then to be able to continue that story in the DLC, to see more of that. And then, yeah, the question of, can we do a standalone Miles Morales experience? And we're like, let's do it. We're so excited about this. And now we have the space to really tell our own Miles story. It's its own standalone game, to tell that story and really focus on Miles. And so that's how it began. And we started talking about, if we're going to tell our own standalone Miles Morales game, what's the story going to be? That's where it all begins. And you marry that gameplay with a meaningful story, and you get magic. And so we just began talking. Who is Miles? What's he about? Who is he as a person? What's his journey? What's the wish fulfillment for the player? If I'm going to play a Miles Morales game, what does that mean? What is that wish fulfillment? How can we deliver that?
You're totally right. You look at Marvel Comics' history, for people that watch the Avengers, Captain America, 1941, Thor, 1950, the 1960s, Fantastic Four, X-Men, Iron Man, Incredible Hulk. And then there's a big gap where there's not a lot of new characters coming online that are resonating to that degree, of these legends, these titans in the Marvel universe. And there was maybe Wolverine kind of snuck in there, Deadpool, and then
Punisher, maybe.
gap.
Well, I think, to be fair, I think each decade, there's characters that are introduced. There's the 60s with the original Marvel characters. But then in the 70s, man, you have this explosion of the monster characters, kung fu characters, Luke Cage, cosmic characters, Adam Warlock. Then 80s, you start getting the grim and gritty, and you have your Electras, right? And you have new versions of Ghost Rider, and Punisher comes back, but with a new intention. And then, and I think each decade, the part of what we try and do at Marvel is each. And it's not organized by decade, but it just happens. We try and introduce characters or bring back older characters and reinterpret them. But you're right. We there's been a ton of characters that are introduced, but how many stick?
Yeah.
That is what you're totally correct on. It's really hard when people already love so many Marvel characters. It's like, well, why should I love this new character? And it's a challenge. So many names are taken, powers, stories. We never want to duplicate ourselves.
Right. And I think something interesting is happening this year, where you look at this decade, 2010, 2020, Miles Morales, and then you also in 2013 had Kamala Khan, right? So, who was just in the Avengers game. Can you just kind of talk about this new generation, this new kind of focus in this last decade for Marvel character creation?
Well, again, that is just the people at Marvel. It's a huge team effort. It's the creators at home, the artists, the writers, and it's the editorial team. It's everyone in publishing, working together, and trying to create new stories and new characters that resonate with us. We really want to tell stories that reflect the world around us. Again, continue that Marvel tradition of being inclusive. And when you are inclusive, then diversity is a result of that. And again, it's just Marvel trying to look around the world, reflect the world back to us, continue to say that everyone can be a hero, everyone deserves to have a hero, and realizing the power of representation. So again, in this case, Miles Morales, Spiderman, it continues that story, and hopefully you'll see it in every single Marvel game.
For people first coming to Miles, or maybe experiencing through the Disney show or the movie, and people who want to get to know him more before the game comes out, are there specific comics you'd recommend that people check out?
Marvel has gotten so good over the last, 10 years of getting everything into print, collecting comics together. It's not like when we were kids and you had to, how do I get this issue where this happened? I have to hunt through the back issue bins. They're very good at collecting everything and making things digital, trying to make it as easy as possible, saying, how do you want to read the comics? Do you want individual copies? Do you want trade paperbacks? You want to go to the bookstore? You want to buy it online? You want to just have it digitally? So there's a ton of options out there. But you can download the Marvel Comics app. You can go to marvel.com, find out all about that, how to get comics digitally. But the ones to focus on, if you want to start an adventure, I always say start at the beginning, and that's where you really find out what the creators were trying to say with the character. And here we are, 9 years later. Well, where did it start? So, hey, go back and check out when Miles debuted in Ultimate Spider-Man, and look at then the first issues of his series. You can go to marvel.com and they have a character search thing, and you can put Miles Morales, and they'll do a whole list of where to start. But hey, go to the very first Miles Morales issue by Brian Michael Bendis, Sarah Pichelli. There's been some miniseries where Miles has crossed over into our dimension. There's one called Spiderman, I believe. There was then the Spider-Verse event where you saw Miles interact with all the different Spider-Men from the different realities. I think the current run, written by Saladin Ahmed, is fantastic. So good. So I would check out that current series. That's what I say. Always just look it up. Miles Morales #1. Start from there. You don't have to read everything. You can jump around, but that's some of the classic stories that really get to the heart of Miles.
I got to know, what's your favorite comic book of all time, completely removed from just Spider-Man?
Well, I mean, I love Spidey so much. I have to talk about Amazing Spider-Man #33. So that was the issue by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and it begins with Spider-Man under the rubble. That famous scene. He's trapped. For those who haven't read it, he's under the rubble. He's buried, and he's going to give up. He feels he can't move it, and he begins to see these images in his head of Aunt May and Uncle Ben. And he thinks to himself, I failed them. I let that burglar go by, and he killed Uncle Ben. But if I can get out of here and get the medicine that Aunt May needs to her, maybe, just maybe, in some small way, I can balance the scales of justice. And so in these 3 wonderful pages, and the way Steve Ditko drew it, the panels begin small and they begin getting bigger and bigger and bigger through 3 pages, and he's struggling. Finally, he lifts the rubble up off his head, this big splash page. And he says, it's a small line, but it says so much. He says, I did it, I'm free. So he's free of the rubble. And I think it's, again, a coming of age moment. He's made this sacrifice, and he literally has gotten the weight of the world. That things he can deliver so well in a Marvel story. He's this rubble. It's on him, and he's gotten the weight of the world off his shoulder. He's made the sacrifice. He didn't give up. He pushed it off, and he's free. He's free of the rubble. Is he free of this guilt? Has he been redeemed? That's the Marvel story, is that we're not the biggest, we're not the strongest, we're underdogs. But when we get into situations where it's really tough, if we don't give up, and if we do the right thing, we can have these small victories. And that's what, in a very real way, everybody wants in their own life. We all want to face a moment where things are tough, and we may want to give up, but we got to dig in deep and do the right thing, motivated by the people we love, and do good things. And to tie it back to Miles, that's what his story is. His father said to him, a hero is someone who just doesn't give up. And that's kind of our North Star with this story. We like to do that. Insomniac is so good at picking one phrase. For the first game, talking to Brian Intihar, it was about, we kept talking about worlds colliding. At Marvel, we're taught the best Spider-Man stories are when the Spider-Man world and the civilian world collide. And in all the comics, when you see the Vulture flying to the Daily Bugle and Spidey's got to save Jonah and who's yelling at him, and the worlds are literally colliding. And that's when you get that superhero soap opera. That's always the best Spider-Man stories. So same thing with a Miles Morales story, a Spider-Man story. It's when his secret identity world and his civilian identity world collide. And he has to make choices. How do I save the people I love from this superhuman threat? So that's why we love Peter and we love Miles, and that's something that Brian Horton, as the creative director of this game, has talked about. Is hero is someone who doesn't give up. Worlds are going to collide. What is Miles going to do? And we care about Miles as Spider-Man because we care about him as Miles, and we care about the people he loves. We care about his mom, Rio. We care about his best friend, Genki. That's what's at risk in the story. And in addition to all of Spanish Harlem that he's trying to save and all of Manhattan, it comes down to these relationships and these people that he's trying to save. And to tie it all back to the comics, that's just we dove into all the issues and checked out who is his supporting cast. You have to have that in a Spider-Man story. So there's his mom, and there's his best friend, and there's the people in the neighborhood, and you have to have all those people, and weave that web, if you will.
Was there anything as you were working with Insomniac where they were coming up with ideas? Is there anything you felt like you had to steer them back on a path? Was anything out of bounds that you're like, no, this doesn't quite fit Spider-Man?
One of the many reasons that all of us at Marvel Games love working with Insomniac, and back when we were in our actual offices, we loved it that they were 15 minutes away. The Marvel Games office is in Glendale, and Insomniac is right next to the Burbank Airport, so we could go back and forth and visit with them and with our team at PlayStation. And it's always a pleasure to get together, whether it's in person or now it's all through Trello and getting on the phone. It's a real pleasure when you work with creators who respect and get the characters. They come to view them as their own, as they should. So many of the decisions that come from Brian Horton, the creative director of Miles Morales, and Ben Arfman, one of the main writers, and the entire team, whether it comes from design or story or gameplay, it all comes from a love of the character. So when you think about a lot of the reaction to the first Spider-Man game, it was so rewarding to see reviewers say, this is a love letter to Spider-Man. So it's all those little decisions that players see and they notice and they get, from the costumes to the dialogue to the characters to everything in the world. So it's the same thing here. Insomniac completely understands and gets Miles, Peter, and their world. So many of the things they do are spot on, and then totally surprising in the right way. Started the first game. Can we make Mary Jane a reporter for the Daily Bugle? Wow, that's awesome. We've never done that before, but it feels right. It feels right for the Spider-Man world. And can Norman be mayor? Oh, cool. It's never happened before, but yeah, that feels. Imagine having one of your enemies in charge of New York and using those forces against you. Again, it feels right. So anytime they pitch us things, it's always spot on or it's surprising, but in a right way that feels right. We're so happy to work with them. It truly is. It's a joy. Marvel Games team. We always say we're fans, and we are lucky to have the opportunity to make games for other fans. And that's it. Talk about power and responsibility. All of us at Insomniac, PlayStation, and Marvel, our power is we get to work with these characters and these creators. Our responsibility is make awesome stuff.